Welcome to PE in School Sport. This lecture we're going to, and next week's lecture, we're going to try and do it through more of a practical rather than a sit-down theoretical lecture. So what we're trying to do now with this lecture and next week's lecture is we're trying to progress and move towards the assessment which we'll be doing after Christmas, which is focusing on fundamental movement skills. So what I'm going to try and do this week and next week is introduce what fundamental movement skills are, and we're going to try and do it through more of a practical context to actually get you doing the movement skills and appreciating and understanding what they actually are. And I think it's really important for guys like yourselves that are working in primary schools and secondary schools, either in a coaching or a teaching or support role, that you actually understand and you appreciate what fundamental movement skills are and how important they are, not just to sporting performance, but lifelong physical activity. So for today's lecture, the outcomes that we're going to focus on, and hopefully you'll have a really good understanding about by the end of this lecture, is we're going to recognize and understand categories of fundamental movement skills. I'm going to ask you to identify and list what fundamental movement skills are. I would like you to identify the phases of movement that contribute to a fundamental movement skill. So fundamental movement skills, or any sports skill, is broken down into 3 or 4 phases. And so from a coaching or a teaching perspective, we need to be able to break that sport skill down or movement skill down and understand what constitutes the various phases of that movement. I'm also going to ask you to observe and analyze those movements. So I'm going to get you to do some practical tasks with each other and get you to assess how competent each of you are in performing these movements. Now, these movements are movements we would expect young children to be competent or master by the age of 11 or 12. So I would expect most of you to be able to do the movements and be very competent at them. However, what I'm trying to get you to understand and appreciate is that when you're working in a PE school sport environment, you as the coach, you as the teacher, you are the ones that have to observe and analyze the movements. I also want you to be able to apply that coaching process or the feedback process. So the feedback process for a young child is that they can start to recognize and understand when they can do something, because they've got those internal mechanisms within their body that tell them that they are doing something correctly. So they've got what we call knowledge of results, knowledge of performance. And knowledge of performance, how it actually feels; knowledge of results, they can see whether they've been successful or not. So young children have got that intrinsic feedback mechanism that tells them how well they perform something or how competent they are at doing something. The coaching process is more to do with ourselves as coaches and teachers. It's where we are observing and analysing sports performance or sports movement or movement skills. So we're observing the movement, we are diagnosing what they are doing wrong, and then we are evaluating and correcting, and then hopefully putting them back into the same situation so that they can do it over and over again and become more competent. So for us as coaches and teachers, this is really important. We need to understand that process of how we observe a movement, we analyze it, we diagnose it, and we correct it. So hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll have a really good understanding of what fundamental movement skills are. Okay, for task 1, like I said at the start of the lecture, I want you to do, this is for the kinesthetic learners, the proprioceptive learners. So what I've tended to do the previous weeks is more for the auditory and the visual learners, those that like seeing and those that like hearing. The next couple of weeks' lectures are for the kinesthetic and the proprioceptive learners. So those learners that like to get involved and they learn by doing. So for the first task, it's going to take about 10 minutes, and what I want you to do in pairs or in small groups of 3 or 4, what I would like you to do is to identify how many fundamental movement skills you can recognize. And to start you off, I'll give you an idea. A fundamental movement skill is any movement that an individual or a young person would use in everyday life or play in sport or physical activity. So for example, running is a fundamental movement. So we're going to spend 10 minutes. I want you to think of as many fundamental movement skills that a young person or an adult might use in everyday life, physical activity, or to play sport.